In this video, you're going to use the callback pattern to improve the weather application. So in the last video, we made a fake version of a geocode function, which took in an address and a callback, and it got you the data when it was available. Now, we faked that by using setTimeout. In this video, we're going to create a real version where we actually create a HTTP request inside of the function. Now, what's that going to allow us to do? Well, it's going to allow us to do two very important things. One, it's going to make it easy to create code that is reusable and easy to maintain. By having separate functions we can call, we can run this code as many times as we need without copying it over and over again. If I want to get the forecast in 5 different locations, I just call a function 5 times, as opposed to needing to copy all of this code and logic. The other important thing is that it's going to make it much easier to do one thing before or after something else. So in this case, we want to first geocode the address, then I want to take the output, the latitude and longitude, and use that to fetch the weather. Now, we could do this without creating our own functions, but it would be pretty terrible. We can show you what that would look like by uncommenting all of the code up above, copying it to the clipboard and pasting it in where it would be needed, which is down here. So right after we get access to the latitude and longitude, I could paste all of that code in, and right away, it's just stressful to look at. Now, if I was going to continue forward with this, I would update the URL over here, concatenating on those variables, and that would indeed work. There are a lot of problems with this code. First, it's hard to read and maintain. Second, it is deeply nested, going up to 6 layers at some point, which just makes code more complex than it needs to be. And third, it's not reusable at all. If I want to fetch the weather somewhere else, I can't because it's nested inside of all of this other code. In reality, we're trying to perform 2 discrete actions, so we should have 2 discrete functions we can use. I'm going to undo those changes I made. We're not going to go that route. We're going to undo them back to the point where we had at the beginning of the video. We have 2 separate requests, which are currently not communicating with one another. Let's go ahead and fix that by creating our little functions. And together, we're going to convert our geocoding example. Then as your challenge for the video, you're going to end up doing the same for our weather request up above. Let's go ahead and get started by commenting out that weather request. And we're actually also going to comment out our current geocoding request. Down below, we're going to do 2 things. We are going to define a function and we're going to call it. Let's start by creating a const geocode like we did in the other file, though this time it's actually going to communicate with the Mapbox API. Now we still need those arguments. So what's the input? What do we need to geocode? I need to know the address. So that's going to get taken in as the first argument, and the second is going to be the callback. This is the function we'll call once we have the latitude and the longitude. Now from here, we are indeed going to call geocode. So we're going to define this function, which means we probably want to use it. Let's go ahead and add an example call in down below, passing in an address. I'm going to use my current location, Philadelphia. Then I'm going to pass in a callback as well. This is where we're going to have access to the results after the geocoding process is complete. When you're working with callback functions and the callback pattern, it's typical to see 2 arguments passed to callbacks, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. You either get an error if things went poorly, or you get your data if things went well. Now, this is not enforced, but it is a common convention you're going to see across many different tools, utilities, and libraries, including what we've already seen with request. If things go poorly, we get an error. Otherwise, we get our response. Only one of these is ever going to have a value. The other will be set to undefined, allowing us to conditionally check what's going on. Now, we have to actually make sure that callback gets called with the correct arguments. So let's go ahead and kick things off by making our request. Now up above, we already have that URL in place. I'm going to take the URL exactly as we have it up above, not including those quotes, and I'm going to copy it to the clipboard. So this is a URL I should be able to paste in the browser to see the geocoding results for the current location, which is statically defined as Philadelphia. I'm going to bring that down below and store it in a URL variable. So I'll create the variable, I'll define the string, and I'll paste the URL inside. Now the entire URL is going to be static except for this one piece right here. This is where the address goes. So I'm going to remove Philadelphia, and I'm going to use the single quote twice. Then I'm going to use the plus operator right here. Now, currently, we're just taking the string beginning and the string end and putting them together. Right in between, we want to put the address. So now we take the beginning of the URL, then we have the address, then we have the end of the URL, and now we're going to make a request to whatever location is provided via that argument. So in this case, it would be Philadelphia, but I could change that to New York if I wanted to geocode somewhere else. This is Andrew from the future with a quick update to the line we just wrote. Right here, we have the before line. This is the line we just wrote together. We have the two parts of the URL, our two strings, and we concatenate the address right in between. Down below, under after, we have the exact same thing. The only difference is what we're adding in between. Right here, instead of just putting the address right into the string, we're first passing the address through a function called encode URI component. Now, that function returns a string, and that's going to get placed in the URL. Now, in almost all situations, you're not going to notice a difference when you run the project with these two different solutions. The only time you're really going to notice is if someone searches for a location that contains special characters that actually mean something in a URL structure. As an example, if you were to use this code up above and search for ? The program would crash. Down below, when we encode those special characters, the question mark becomes the encoded version, which for this particular character is the %, then 3 capital F. This is a safe URL. Mapbox is going to be able to get it, decode it, and handle the request correctly. So take just a quick moment to replace address with this function call right here, then test out your code and make sure things still work as expected. All right, let's jump back into the class. Now that we have a dynamic URL based off of the arguments to the geocode function, let's actually fire off the request. I'll start by calling request, passing in the options object as the first argument. We are going to set up the URL property. I have the value in the URL variable, and from there I'll also set up JSON as true, making sure the data gets parsed for us. Next up, we do have to provide the second argument, a function to run, when the request completes. Right here, I am going to provide my function like we've done with our two other request calls, and like those calls, for example, right here, we get access to error and to response, and we're going to use both of those down below. Now, what's the next step? The next step is to once again use an if statement to figure out exactly what happened. Did things go well? Did things go poorly? That's the next thing we have to do. So right here, we're going to start with an if statement. I am going to check if there is an error. If there is, we are going to do something like we did before. Now, the important piece to the puzzle is the actual message. Up above, we chose to log that message to the console. Now down below, the goal is to create a function that is highly reusable. When someone calls geocode, they might want to do something different with the error message than log it to the console. Maybe they want to save it to a log file on the file system or send it to their sysadmin via an email. Those are all things you could do with the message, and it's up to geocode to be as flexible as possible. So instead of logging out the error, we're going to pass it back to the callback. The callback can then choose what to do. So I could call geocode 5 different times and do 5 different things with the error message. So right here inside of the if statement, what are we going to do? We are going to call callback for the very first time in this function. Now we know that the callback function expects 2 arguments. We're going to have an error if there is one, otherwise we'll have data. Now in this case, we do indeed have an error, so we are going to provide the first argument and we're going to provide undefined as the value for the second. Right here, let's go ahead and set up the string. So we are going to call the callback with a string for the first value. Now the first argument and the first one line up, so this is the error. And we are going to say exactly what we set up above. Unable to connect to location services. Perfect. So now that message is getting sent back to the caller, and they can choose to do whatever they want, making geocode as flexible as possible. Now remember, we don't want to provide a value for that second argument. If we don't provide anything here, undefined will be the value assigned by JavaScript. We could always be a bit more explicit setting up undefined, though both solutions would be identical. So we've handled the if statement with the error. Now we're going to move on to the else if. So else if, our condition, and the code to run. In this case, we want to check if the feature's length is 0, meaning that we didn't get any search results. Down below, let's knock that out. So right here, else if response dot body dot features dot length, so we're looking at the length of that array, equals 0. If it does, we have a problem. What are we going to do? We are going to call callback. So in this case, we are also trying to report an error. So we're going to provide the string message as the first argument and undefined as the second. What do we want to say? We'll say exactly what we said up above. Unable to find location, period, try another search. Excellent. So now that we have this in place, we actually have error handling all set up. This callback would correctly get called if something went wrong with the request. Let's test our work before going any further. Inside of geocode, just to make sure things work, we will choose to use console.log, but it's important to note that's a choice. Because we just get the raw string back, we could do whatever we want with it. Right here, I am going to print error. Then as the second argument, I'll print the actual error message. And down below, I'll do the same thing for data, just making sure that we're always getting the results we expected. I'll call console.log with the data string, then I'll actually print the data variable. Now to test things out, we want to first do something like disable our internet connection and make sure we get that message. So up above, I am going to turn off my Wi-Fi, and down below, in the terminal, we have to get back over to the weather app directory. So cd ... to get out of playground, then / weather-app. Once I'm there, I'm going to use clear to clear the terminal output, then I'll run the script. Node space app.js. When I run it, what are we going to get? Right here, I get as my error, unable to connect to location services, and as data, I get undefined, which is fantastic. That is exactly what we were looking for. Now let's go ahead and re-enable our network connection, and we're going to try with a location that's not going to return any matches. Down below, I'm going to swap out New York for something else like 12 what? I'm going to save app.js. I'm going to rerun the exact same command, and what do I get? Unable to find location. Try another search. So all of our error handling is done. We can now move on to the easy part, which is to set up the else clause and call the callback with the data that we want to expose. Now, once again, it's our choice. How much of what comes back on response do we want to share? And the reality is we only want to share a couple of values. I'm going to choose to share the latitude and the longitude, and I'm also going to share one other value that came back. If I go back to the request in the browser, I can swap it out with a real search. I'll just search for Philadelphia once again. And these are the two values we're going to start with. And I'm also going to include the place name. So when we print out the forecast, we can include a more complete description of exactly where they're getting the weather for. All right, let's go ahead and work on that by filling out else. Right here, we are going to call the callback, and I am going to provide to it two arguments. The first, remember, is where we would put the error, but in this case, we know there is none, so I am going to set that value equal to undefined. That's going to make sure that when the callback runs, it does not have a value for error, and it has a value for data. So the second argument I pass to callback, that's going to be the data. When things go well, we're going to provide the caller down below with those three values, the latitude, the longitude, and we're going to provide them with the place name, that label we just explored. Let's go ahead and knock all of that out using the exact same stuff we did up above. So first up, we have latitude. I'll set that up as a property on this object. We know the value for that lives on response, .body, .features. We're going to access the first item in that features array, And then we're going to access the center property, which is an array itself, and we'll grab the first item from that, which is exactly what we've already done up above. Next up, we're going to add another property onto here, longitude. This value is going to come from response dot body dot features, grabbing the first one, then dot center, grabbing the second one. Perfect. This matches up with what we had up above. Next up, we're going to add that other property. Now, I could call this place name, but I could also choose something that makes a bit more sense. I'll just have location. Right here, we are going to get that value from response.body. We still need to go into that first feature. So dot features, grabbing the first item. From there, we have the place name property. So that would be dot place name. Dot place underscore name. Perfect. Now that we have this in place, when things go well, when the search returns results, we are going to get that object sent back as the value for data. Let's go ahead and see if that actually happens. Right here, I'm going to swap out 12 what with something else. I'll choose to use my current location, Philadelphia. I'm going to save the file. I'm going to rerun the script from down below, and what do I get? I get the latitude, the longitude, and the label showing up. And now if we wanted to change what we were searching for, we could just update the geocode first argument. Right here, there is a Philadelphia in New York as well, though it's less popular, so I'm not going to get that back as the default result. But if I do add New York on and I search for that, I can now see the latitude and longitude for that city instead. Now we can easily call geocode more than one time to geocode from different places in our application. We have all of that sitting behind a single reusable function we can use as many times as we need. Let's wrap up by pulling that out into a separate file. Then we'll move on to the next video where you're going to do something similar for the forecast. I'm going to close all other files besides app.js. I'm going to make a new directory over in weather app, which I will call utils. And in there, we're going to make a single file for now. So we will call this one something like geocode.js. And all we're going to do is take the function code from over here. We're going to remove it from app.js, cutting it out to the clipboard, and we're going to paste it over here. Now I am going to have to require request. We'll do that real quick. Const request equals what comes back from calling require and passing in the module name. Then down below, we're going to export it. So module.exports equals the geocode function. Perfect. Now this file's all done, and we can easily require this anywhere we want to use it, including in app.js. Let's go ahead and wrap up by doing just that. Up above, we're going to grab the constant geocode from a call to require, and since we're loading in a local file, we start with // From there, we want to go into the utils directory, then / the file name, which is geocode, once again, leaving off the optional file extension. Now I'm going to save things. I'm going to swap out the location for somewhere else. Let's go ahead and use something like Boston. I'll save the file. I'll rerun the script, and this is going to make sure that things are still working. And right here, we are getting the location information for Boston. Excellent. Now that we have all of this done for geocode, it's going to be your job in the next video to do the same thing for our weather request. I'm excited to get to that. So let's go ahead and jump right into the next video where I'll show you what I'd like you to do.